Hey fearsome friends, it's cold, dark and wet outside as I read these stories to you, and it's perfect. So sit back, relax and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. A few months ago, I was up late journaling in my living room, which was on the ground floor of my town home. It was a rainy night around 1 a.m, and my husband was upstairs asleep because he worked early in the morning. I regularly stayed up late and was completely in my zone, lost in thought, when I heard the most gentle knock on the back door. Now I want to explain the layout of my home, along with many others similar. They were off a busier road, but it was dead that night as it was midweek and stormy out. My house backs onto another complex, but mine is right in the middle of about 30 other homes, so whoever it was knocking had randomly picked mine out of a lineup. The tapping did startle me, but I figured it was just the storm, as my dog usually barks at any sign of movement. But even this startled him too. It was also strange that anyone would come to my back door instead of the front, as all the buildings were connected, so you'd have to walk quite a way around the back to get to it. The back door was glass, but had a metal screen door, and there was no peephole, so you couldn't see who was outside with the blinds closed. So I snuck into the dark kitchen and stood there dead still for a moment until the knocking became louder. Now I don't know what came over me, but just then I flung the door open, which is when I got really scared, because there was a small, soaking wet man just standing there with his head down, 1 inch from where the door had opened. He had to have been resting his head against it, inside the metal screen one, which was weird in itself, because I figured that the metal door would have been locked for sure. I was so startled I gasped and jumped back as he quietly said, "Can you help me?" My fight or flight kicked in, and all I said was, "No," and slammed the door in his face, locked it, and ran back to the living room where he couldn't see me. I was shaking so badly, I froze and just couldn't move on the couch, heart pounding. I debated calling the cops or waking up my husband, but I figured as this man hadn't done anything actually intimidating or harmful, it would be pointless. But I didn't hear him knock on anyone else's door either, which I also found weird. Eventually I calmed down and worked up the nerve to go to sleep upstairs, but I was still shaken the next morning when I went to take my dog out and noticed something that made my blood run cold. A 2-foot barbecue fork had been taken off our grill where it was clipped, and was now propped up against my door as soon as I opened it. I don't know if it was a threat or what, but I was absolutely terrified of letting my dog out at night for a while. When I told my husband about it all, he said we should call the cops, but it seemed too late. Though we did tell my complex manager, and thankfully nothing has happened like that since. This happened to me a few years ago whilst travelling. I was private tutoring, and my boss sent me to his office to pick up my paycheck at the end of the first month. He gave me the address of where to go, so my boyfriend and I at the time drove there, and he waited outside for me as I went in to get it. It was a tall building, and I approached what looked like a security guard. I showed him the address I had written down to make sure it was the right place, and he studied it, nodded and told me it was on the 5th floor. Then he showed me to the direction of the elevator. As I got into the elevator, he stepped in with me, pressing the button for floor 5. I assumed it was his job to escort people to the right floors, but he was staring at me up and down the entire time. I glanced down at the address my boss had written and realized it said the 2nd floor, not 5th. I turned to the security guard and said, "I think you're a little confused as this says 2nd. He made out he didn't understand me because of a supposed language barrier, so I started to repeat the number 2 in Vietnamese instead. He completely ignored me and instead turned and gave me this creepy smile, which still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. Suddenly, he reached out and started to stroke my hair, saying, "So beautiful." I froze on the spot and started to shout no at him over and over, and thankfully by this point the doors to the elevator had opened. I stepped out and looked around, and there was absolutely nothing there. It was under construction. There was paint and dirty old sheets everywhere, including all over the floor. I ran towards the window and looked outside to see if I could get my boyfriend's attention, but I was too high up, and the creepy guy had gotten out too and was pointing me down an empty corridor. He looked really frustrated now and was blocking the elevator so I couldn't get back in it. I pretended to walk towards the corridor, and he followed me. But when I got to the door, I bolted back to the elevator and started to press the button to the ground floor. He followed me, and whenever the door would close, he would just press the button from the other side and they'd open again. He was shouting at me in Vietnamese and looked really angry. Adrenaline had kicked in, and I was literally thinking about anything I could use to defend myself if he tried anything with me. I began to scream as loud as I possibly could to make him back off, as I pressed the ground floor button and the doors began to close again. He smiled at me once more, with that awful creepy smile that I think about all the time, and my heart was in my mouth as I imagined what would be waiting for me when the doors inevitably opened again. However, to my surprise, the elevator started moving towards the ground floor this time, and I managed to get out. As soon as those doors opened, I ran as fast as possible and was crying by the time I got to my boyfriend. He wanted to go back inside, but I stopped him and made him drive home, fast. The same day, I called my boss and explained what had happened, and it turns out I wasn't even in the right building, never mind the right floor. I blame myself for getting the wrong address, and I don't know why the guy in there pretended that I was in the right building, or what his intentions were, or even why he'd decided to just let me go. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, or maybe he was trying his luck with me. I have no idea, but I think about it from time to time, or tell the story again to someone, and it really creeps me out to think of what could have been. I've never gotten into an elevator with a man ever again. So I lived in a border town growing up. Mexico was pretty safe at that time, and high school kids going across the border was no big deal, as our parents did it as well. It was the summer before I went to college, and I worked as a cocktail waitress at a nightclub, catering to the white residents of the city, as well as people from the Air Force Base. I was becoming friends with another waitress, who was a blonde, blue-eyed girl, well off, and whose parents left her by herself at their house by the lake. I was poor and Hispanic, but she was always nice to me. The club closed at 2 a.m, and if we wanted to have fun ourselves, we would have to go to Mexico, because at the time, friends' parties were finished. Now this girl had been dating a rich Mexican guy. She was 17 to 18, and he was 19 to 20, and was considered a poppy, which is a name for a rich Mexican. One night after one of our shifts, my friend asked if I wanted to go with her and her boyfriend to a party in Mexico. I agreed. Then we were picked up in a beautiful black car by his driver, and he had a couple of friends with him, all well off and good looking. They took us to a club that knew them, and as soon as we walked in, the waiters brought multiple bottles of good quality liquor, mixers and garnishes. I had a blast, and her friends were kind and respectful. I drank a little bit, but not much, and we were only there for about an hour when the bar started to close, so the guy suggested we go to Boystown. Now, for those of you who don't know about the US-Mexico border, there is usually a red light district with drugs, drinks and prostitution. I agreed to go because I felt safe with my current group, who were rich Mexicans and probably well known, and I like adventure as I'm a bit of a risk taker. Any trouble we'd come across would probably be from cops, and we could just give the crooked cops some cash. We took this fancy car through a dark dirt road outside of the small city until we saw the flashing red lights of Boystown. It was like a movie set. We went to one of the bars and enjoyed the show, which was a mix of drunk college boys, Mexican cowboys, and the desperate women looking for their mark. The whole night my friend's boyfriend and his friends had treated us to drinks, and I was getting more and more drunk. I needed to use the restroom, so I walked down a red-lit hallway and encountered a prostitute wearing only a see-through scarf around her hips. She smiled at me and curled her finger to beckon me to a small room. So being the curious girl I am, I was tempted. She was beautiful, with wavy black hair. I smiled and started walking towards her, when I suddenly felt strange. Surrounded, I guess is the right word. I stopped and started to feel very uneasy, as she continued to try to lure me into one of the small side rooms. I shook my head and returned to the table with my friends, and another drink was waiting for me. I took a couple of sips and just felt very uncomfortable, so I told my friend that I didn't feel so well, and asked them to stop buying me drinks. And this is the scary part. She said, "We haven't been buying your last few drinks, like it was nothing." What the hell? I quickly turned to the bar and noticed that there were several men looking my way. Someone I didn't know was sending me drinks. I told the group that I had to go, and that if we didn't leave I would make a scene, so we left. I headed home and didn't speak, and I felt super wired and amped. I hadn't felt like that before or since, and I was off and feeling out of control. I got home around 6 a.m, just as my mother was waking up, and was wondering what had happened. I told her I had hung out with my friend, her boyfriend and their friends, and I proceeded to stay up wired for hours, trying to act normally. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but I think there was some sinister intentions in that club that night. I was a pretty girl who was poor, and if I'd have disappeared, no one would have batted an eyelid. Was that prostitute trying to get my money, or was she luring me into a trap? Who was buying me drinks that ended in me feeling out of control? So this happened on my 19th birthday when I was living in Vermont, on a mountain far away from home, as a working student on a massive horse breeding farm. It was February, and obviously very snowy, and we'd left a multiple-day, out-of-state event in the evening to head back to the farm. I was driving my own car, a sporty old coupe but front-wheel drive, with the new sales rep as a passenger. We're both women, and she was maybe 25 or so, and the other working students were riding with the boss in the big rig, or with another who was driving her van. We convoyed with everyone else until around 12 a.m, when the trailer had an issue near Albany, New York. We'd encountered snowfall all night, as there was a blizzard going on, but it was now getting bad around this time and area. The boss told me and the sales rep to keep going so that we could make it back for the morning chores in case they didn't. The barn manager was the only one who stayed back at the farm, and we knew she slept like a sloth on tranks and was expecting to have the day off, as we would all be back. Everyone else stayed so that there was enough hands to unload the horses if needed. For the rest of the trip at around 3 a.m, the sales rep and I reached the back roads to get up the mountain to the farm. By this point there was about 4 inches of snow on the roads, so we kept having trouble getting up hills and tried every route we could think of. I didn't have a lot of gas left, and we were tired and getting nervous. The sales rep suggested another route she thought she knew, and I figured why not. I'd never been this way because I would simply drive the same way down the mountain to go to town on my day off. We got pretty far with this other road, but the snow was still falling and I was having trouble with another hill. By this time we saw a house, which are extremely few and far between in that area, and I was able to pull into the bottom of the driveway. It looked like they had a truck up there, and there was light in a window, so we decided that we would knock and ask them if they could drive us to the farm. I know this sounds totally nuts, But everyone knew of the farm, and the boss had been there forever and seemed to know everyone personally. Plus we were together, so we figured it would be okay, and it would hopefully be a nice man who knew our boss. But of course, this is where things got weird. We made our way up, when suddenly a dog started viciously barking and lunging at the end of a very short, heavy chain, which was attached to a tree, during a blizzard and at night. This startled the crap out of us, and obviously we didn't like it on an ethical level, but the house was only a few yards away now, so we sprinted to it. We got to the door, and right as the sales rep was about to knock, I grabbed her hand, because now that we were up close and not chatting or dealing with the scary dog, I noticed the door was only a piece of plywood on hinges, and the little house was a crappy-looking shack. I was basically thinking that whoever lived here had built their own permanent shelter, but didn't have the skills to do it properly. Meanwhile, the dog was still barking and lunging on the chain. She saw what I saw, so we decided to leave, then ended up running to the car, because it was just one of those redneck properties that you imagine wouldn't appreciate visitors. It snapped us back to our senses that there could be multiple men inside, or someone dangerous, especially considering the dog situation. I managed to drive up the hill that was giving me trouble before, and as we got going, we saw a herd of mini horses run across the road in a line and jump into the woods. We had a good idea, maybe not the best considering what had just happened, but it was that if we found a farm along this road, it could be their horses, and they'd be grateful for our help catching them and drive us home. Not long after, we came to a well-kept little farm, and the road was a dead end right after. The sun was starting to come up now, and we left the car on the road to walk up to the house, which wasn't set far back at all. We knocked endlessly though, and no one answered, but just as we started to walk back to the car, the sales rep spotted something running up the road. It was the dog. We ran like hell to the car and got in just in time for the dog to jump around the outside of my car, and it was biting the mirrors and whatever it could get hold of like it was deranged. Now to be clear, I love dogs. We lived with the manager's pit bull, and I've now been working with dogs in many settings, including shelters, for years. I've had bad bites, and have worked with court-declared dangerous dogs, but I have never seen one in person as aggressive as this before or after. We got the heck out of there, and I drove as fast and as safely as I could, away from the dog, and we thankfully didn't see anything else on the road, or glancing down the driveway of that shack, driving past it again. When we got stuck on the next hill, we simply parked at the end of another driveway and sat there. My gas light was on, and we were using the battery to run the heat, and by that point we were completely delirious, just laughing and crying whilst keeping on the lookout for the dog or a crazy man. Eventually, around 6:30 a.m, we saw a plough truck coming and got out to flag it down. He knew our boss and gladly ploughed our way home for us. I really do believe someone sicked the dog on us, because the chain was so heavy and we were almost a mile up the road when it got to us. We had also been watching the mirrors as we left the shack, because we were so freaked out already. Whether they thought we were going to break in, or were just mad that someone came up the driveway, I'll never know. I'm just glad it was an almost creepy encounter with whoever lived in the mountain shack. What I'm going to tell you is not very terrifying, but it particularly marked me as I was only 11 years old. At that time I was living in a gendarmerie because my father was a gendarme, which is a kind of military police, and the barracks was located in a small village of 3,000 inhabitants, so if we wanted to see each other with friends, we didn't hesitate to walk. One afternoon I decided to go out to see a friend at his place, to ask him if he wanted to go out and play. So my mother allowed me to go, even though my brother didn't want to go with me, but I was quite calm about it because I knew which way to go. The journey there went without incident, and I was coming up to a steep descent, which will be important at the end. Arriving in the street, I noticed that there was a group of motorcyclists, which, if my memory serves, comprised of 5 people, and they were entirely equipped. They followed me very slowly as I entered the street, but at that moment I didn't pay much attention to their slow pace, since the street was rather narrow, so I guessed they were just being cautious. But what intrigued me was where they were going. Let me explain. You see, the street is a dead end, containing only my friend's house, and this same street was isolated from the others, so one could easily eliminate the idea of a U-turn. The last plausible idea was that they were visiting my friend's family, but that didn't seem right. By the time they'd entered the street, I'd had time to realize that no car was parked in front of his house, so I quickly concluded that he was not home, and I decided to turn around. Only, at that moment of doing so, the group of bikers were standing still on the road. But why? I had the biggest, worst feeling of my life right then. To go back, I'd have to go through the group. I was terrified. I decided to stall them and see what they would do during the time saved. Without turning my head, I rang the bell of my friend's house, but of course he didn't answer, and I was expecting this. But deep down I was praying for him to open the damn wooden door. Why the hell didn't I have the strength to break it down? Fear was enveloping me, and I didn't know what to do. I was alone against a group of bikers, of which I didn't know anything about or their intentions. I decided to make a U-turn then, saying to myself, "You live in a ridiculously small village, and you're the son of a gendarme. Nobody can touch you. It's impossible." Just then I heard a voice say, "Are you done?" This sentence paralyzed me, so I made the quick decision to get the hell out of there and started to run, arriving at a crossroads. At that moment I heard the motorcycles coming back and I was shaking. I didn't know what to do, as there were no cars or other people around. I was on my own. Luckily though, I could easily bypass the crossroads by cutting through a grass shortcut, which the motorcycles would only be able to bypass to reach the next road. The shortcut I was taking is a grassy area that separates 2 parallel roads, which meet at a traffic circle next to it, thus the crossroads in question. Lucky me decided to continue running when I came to the steep descent that was now uphill. Exhausted already, I looked at it, and I told myself that everything was going to be okay. That is, until I heard the bikes catching up with me. I ran with all my might, letting out my first tears, because I didn't want to die. I made the climb before them, and there were only 50 meters left to go before the gate of the barracks, which was waiting for me wide open. The gate of paradise, yes. I ran and reached the gate, more than happy that I'd seen them passing by. I decided to give them a middle finger, to which they didn't answer, and at that the story ends. When I got home, I told my mother everything, and she didn't let me go out alone anymore. On the one hand, I understood why, but I was also really upset by this, as for a whole year I couldn't do anything without my brother being with me, but I did feel better that he was there, to be honest. That day with the bikers traumatized me, but since I didn't know what their real intentions were, I've tried to put it in perspective since. I could have interpreted this whole situation completely wrong, but it was just so weird. I live in a drug town with a high crime rate, and I'm a 5'4" girl, so I'm not particularly safe. There was supposedly a Seventh-day Slumber concert at my church, and I wanted to hang with a friend instead of going, but my mum told me that I needed to attend because it was important. I can't remember why though. I actually like Seventh-day Slumber, and my friend is into hard rock too, so I suggested it to her, and she was cool with going. She lives right downtown, so we figured we could just walk there, and we spent the whole day with 2 of her guy friends before they left when the sun was going down. Then we made our way over to the church. It was quickly getting dark, and on the way there was a group of men all wearing different coloured hoodies, and a couple of them had caps on. All of them were smoking, and they were blocking the sidewalk. And even by this point, I'd had a couple of creepy experiences downtown already, so I asked my friend if we could go back around and cross to the other side of the road. I had nothing against the guys, as it looked like they were just smoking and talking, but I don't really trust any man in my town, especially after some of the awful experiences and relationships I've had in the past, plus seeing all the sex trafficking, robberies and missing person cases on the news, not to mention a few murders thrown in, so you can never be too safe. We were on the other side of the road and just kept walking, and when we got to the church it was pitch black inside. It turned out that my mum had gotten the wrong date, and the concert was supposed to be next Friday. So my friend and I decided we'd just go to the bank and ask her dad to drive us to her house. Walking back, the smoking dudes were on the other side of the road still, but I noticed they'd kind of looked like they were watching us. They were still a ways diagonal in front of us on the side of the road, so I didn't care much. But then I noticed one of them split off from the rest of the group and went straight across the road. Ahead of us was this tiny veterinarian building, and it looked like he'd gone in there. But again, I brushed it off, thinking he might have just been grabbing his pet or something. The vet building is actually two tiny buildings with a wooden alley in between, with enough room for 2 cars to park. And behind the alley and buildings is the creek that runs through the whole county, so he wouldn't be back there. I got a little paranoid when I realized that the building was actually closed and the lights were only on because a worker was normally closing up at this time. So why did the guy cross the street? There wasn't anything besides the vets or the creek. The guys on the other side were still watching us, and I figured I was just being paranoid. But to be safe, I asked my friend if we could quickly run past the building instead of walking. She was kind of paranoid too, probably because it was dark. So we both started running as fast as we could. As we passed, I looked into the alley to see what he was doing, and he was sitting at the very end of it, right next to the edge of the road where we were going to be walking, and he and I made brief eye contact. It was kind of creepy, but we passed him safely. When we were maybe 15 feet away then, we stopped running and switched to walking, because I figured I was being ridiculous. But after a bit of walking, I turned my head to see if a car was coming, because we were on the side of the road with no sidewalk, so a car could easily swerve and hit us. But my heart sunk when I saw the same guy following close behind, and was maybe 6 feet away. In a panic, I told my friend he was following us, and we ran to the bank without stopping, as it's a public place, and people were always there at that time. Plus her dad could be there in 5 minutes to pick us up if we needed him to. I think it was somewhere around 9:50 p.m. by the time we got there, and the two of us were startled as hell. Honestly, like I said, I could have misread the whole situation, because this town makes me paranoid as it is. There's lots of creeps here, but I'd rather do something about it and turn out to be wrong, than not do anything and end up being right. My big love bug of a parrot is well trained, and I take him out into the world on his harness. He loves it, and it's really stimulating and enriching for him. He's really cool, so I don't blame people for it necessarily, but he tends to attract a lot of attention. We live in a small tourist town, so it's not just regulars and locals that I deal with, and I never really know what to expect. Most of the time it's harmless, just someone curious about him. But I'm pretty socially awkward, and sometimes it's really good for me to talk to the public about him. However, sometimes it puts me in weird, sketchy and uncomfortable situations, as it's not uncommon for people to corner me, block my path, or chase me down yelling things like, "Excuse me, stop, can you stop, come back, I want to see the bird." Please don't do this. The weird ones almost always ask, "How much is he worth?" which is a red flag. I try to change the subject or say something vague. Then the extra rude ones always keep pushing. "Yeah, but how much?" This one particular day, I'd had enough of the harassment and wanted a peaceful day out for us both. So I walked with my bird to this quieter end of the town, which usually just had the odd local walking by. There's a footpath, a grassy hill, and a bench at the bottom, and I was by myself, so I made sure to sit a ways down the grassy hill, in a spot where we could see people coming from both directions. We sat down with our smoothie, and my bird immediately dived in and starts ripping up the grass. He was in his happy place, and I was hanging out playing on my phone, playing with my bird and watching my surroundings. This is great, I thought. There's been barely anyone. Those that have walked by haven't really noticed us, and we're far enough away from the path for anyone, so it would be pretty exceptionally awkward to approach us. There's maybe going to be the occasional dog person that walks by, but dogs are meant to be on a leash here, even though I know that people don't always listen. So I stayed vigilant. We had gotten some shade and were happily sharing our smoothie and playing in the grass. Life was good. Then I noticed this man walking along the footpath. He had a schnauzer dog, and it was on one of those horrid retractable leashes that no one ever seems to use correctly. But alas, I noticed him, then he noticed me. And usually dog people are pretty good about keeping a distance. He walked along. Sweet. But then the dog noticed us and began running towards us, all the way to the very end of his retractable leash, and then he was jerked to a halt. Barking savagely, I thought, okay, he's going to pull him back, which he did, and phew. I looked away for half a second. But then he let him off the leash. The dog flew towards us, and my bird let out an alarm call and backed up to me. As it happened, I instinctively scooped him up and threw him on my shoulder, standing up and dropping my smoothie in the grass. The dog was leaping at me from uphill and scratched at me, all the while barking and acting savagely and inconsolable. Amidst protecting my feathered companion and fighting off this tiny bearded asshole, I managed to utter a, "Not cool, get your dog!" The man casually walked towards us, laughing hysterically and with no intention of stopping the chaos, and I was still being attacked by this vicious little dog. Again I exclaimed, "Are you kidding me? Get your dog off of me!" This time I got his attention. "What did you just say to me, little girl?" he said with some accent, maybe German. "I said, get your dog the hell away from us. This isn't funny." He was now directly in front of me and had stopped laughing. "You better watch your mouth. You don't know who you're talking to," he said, and proceeded to snatch me by my wrist. Also, please remember, this stupid dog is still savagely jumping on me, trying to get to my bird. I haven't ever been physically grabbed like that by a stranger, and I yelled louder and more ferociously than I probably ever have at another human being. "Get the hell off me!" and I jerked my arm back. Miraculously, I broke free of his grasp, and as I did, he geared up to backhand me. He took a swing and I leapt back screaming, "Get away from me!" "You need to take better care of your pet," he said. "You have no idea who you're talking to." Thankfully, another old man was walking along the footpath now, came out from the corner and saw the commotion. He immediately ran down and intercepted another swinging backhand coming my way and kicked the dog off of me. The evil old Germanish man continued to threaten me and told me to take better care of my pet again, whilst the nice man shooed him away. He finally collected his dog and backed off, then slowly trailed away shouting insults and yanking his dog along. The nice man sat with me for a minute in the grass until we were sure he was gone, and I was shaking up, literally shaking. He kindly talked me down, and it was a stressful walk home alone. I stopped for no one and was constantly looking over my shoulder. Luckily, it seemed my bird had forgotten about the whole incident pretty quickly and was back to his cheery self that evening. I, though, unfortunately hadn't, and it really frightens me going anywhere alone now. It's safe to say that when I do, though, I'll be putting up with the annoying tourists from now on. After sharing one of my recent creepy encounters, I was inspired to share this one from high school. Back in 2015, I was dog-sitting for a family that my parents knew really well. They lived in a wealthier neighborhood and had 3 dogs, and it was a very safe area, so my parents were okay with me doing it, even though I was still in high school. They had contractors working on their deck outside at that time, and I was notified of this by the homeowners. They told me the guys would never have a reason to come inside the house, so I shouldn't have any concerns about interacting with them. One evening I returned to the house after school and cheer practice, and I walked through the threshold and down the hallway into the kitchen, which was in the back of the house, to let the dogs outside. There was literally a man just standing there staring at me, and none of the lights were on. I almost had a heart attack. I flipped the switch on and it looked like it was one of the contractors. He was smiling like a psychopath, holding up the spare key from outside, and said, "You're staying here all alone, right? You should have hidden this key better." The key was hidden in the front of the house under a rock. And not only that, it was a very well hidden rock, which had been placed in the back of the garden and under a bush. The contractors were working in the back of the house, so there was absolutely no reason for them to have found that key, which tells me this guy had been purposely looking for it. I told him to leave immediately or I'd call the cops, and as he was walking by me to go, he whispered to me, "The cops won't do much. It wasn't breaking and entering." Then he handed me back the spare key. I immediately called the homeowners, and they were obviously freaked out on my behalf, so they called the contracting company to fire them, and wanted to know the name of the exact guy who'd entered their home. But it turns out that this dude wasn't even actually part of the contracting company at all, and the whole team that was at the house every day was at that moment with their boss at dinner. So, some random dude had been watching the house, found out I was there alone, pretended to be one of the contractors, and broke in just to mess with me. Thank God my father came and spent the night with me after that, and thank God this creep didn't do anything worse. To this day we still have no idea who he was or how he found the key. I'm fairly confident he didn't try anything though, because once I'd come through the door, the owner's largest dog, which is a Labradoodle, came downstairs. The creep obviously didn't know this, but that dog was extremely timid and shy, and the reason he didn't come down when he entered was because he was probably hiding, and felt comfortable to come down once he'd heard me. I think the presence of a big dog scared him. When I turned 9, my parents finally let me start walking to school. It wasn't far, and even though they were worried, I assured them I would be fine, and I was so excited because my best friend lived next door, and that meant we could walk to school and back together every day. Things were going great the first few weeks, and we had so much fun laughing and talking all the way to school and back home. There was a liquor store along the way that we would stop at on the way home to get some snacks and candies, but only on Fridays. It was our little treat and the thing we looked forward to at the end of the week. One Friday afternoon after school, we began our walk to the liquor store, talking about school as usual. It was just like any other time we went to the store. We would rush in laughing all the way to the candy, pick our favourites and hop in line to pay. But this time there was a man with a pack of beer, and he looked like he worked in construction or something. He was in line before us with another man, but when he saw us, he let us go first. We thought he was just being nice, so we happily obliged, and as I talked to the cashier, my friend stayed behind me. I could hear the 2 men behind us speaking in Spanish and laughing, so I turned around to look, and see my friend with a nervous look on her face. She grabbed my arm hard after I paid and practically pulled me out of the store. I kept asking her what was wrong, and she said she didn't feel safe and we should just run home. I was confused and I wanted us to enjoy our candy on the way back like we always did, until she told me what she had heard. Now I don't speak Spanish, but she did, and apparently the two men were talking about me. She said that one of them pointed to me and said, "She looks like the one." They both laughed and agreed, and the one with the beer said, "Let's follow them and we can grab her around the corner. She's small and won't put up a fight." I froze in fear. We were still in the parking lot of the store and didn't know what to do. We looked around us and saw the two men get into a big work truck. They didn't even glance our way. So I told my friend they were probably just joking, and we were being paranoid for being so scared. But boy, was I wrong. My friend didn't agree with me and said they were definitely serious and we should start running. I was hesitant at first until I turned around and the truck was right behind us. I took one look at my friend and we grabbed hands and ran as fast as we could, our hearts racing, and we didn't dare turn around. We were both crying, and I ended up dropping our bag of candy. We turned the corner and there was the truck. My heart dropped. The man in the passenger seat hopped out and began to approach us. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were locked on me. I have never been that terrified in my life. I was frozen in fear, and my friend, however, started yelling at the man in Spanish, and he seemed to get angry. There was a busy road to the left of us, and it was our only way out. We knew what we had to do without even saying it. T5R 4R. We didn't look left or right, we just ran for our lives across traffic. A car almost ended up hitting us, but they slammed on the brakes and started honking. We just kept running until we were about a block from our houses, and were out of breath and hysterical. We thought we had made it, but then we heard a whistle, and we looked and it was the truck. The men were on the other side of the street, windows down and whistling at us. We had no option but to run as fast as we could to our house, and my mum was in the front gardening, and she was shocked to see us running and screaming. We couldn't get our words out right. All we managed to say was truck following us. She immediately ran to the street to see the truck peel away, and as soon as she calmed us down, she called the cops to take a report, but nothing ever came of it, and I was never allowed to walk to school again. Now, I don't know if this is something many people would consider creepy, but at the time it raised quite a few red flags to say the least. I was working as a cart pusher at a local Walmart near my house, and at the time I was 17 and a senior in high school. For this reason, amongst others, I only worked Mondays, Wednesdays and weekends from 4 p.m. to 11, as these were the only times I was available. One day at around 5:30, I saw this man parked in the parking lot, sporting the textbook Predator getup. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit that I'm a very paranoid person in general, so naturally I took a couple of minutes out of my work time to memorize as many details about this man as I could. He was a heavy-set, middle-aged man, bald with hair on the side of his head, a thick mustache, and a buzz-cut beard. He looked to be of average height as far as I could tell, with him still being inside of his car. He wore an ashy black t-shirt and a pair of pitch-black shades. Shades. This guy was rocking a pair of thick-bridge sunglasses at 5:30 p.m. in the dead of an Ohio autumn, while sitting in the parking lot of a Walmart. I mean, the sun isn't completely gone yet, but it has surely foregone the point of beaming directly into your vehicle. Not to mention he was facing the opposite direction of which the sun was setting. And if that's not enough for you, here's the cherry on top. This car that the guy was driving was a white van. Literally. He was driving a 2008 Angel White Hoopty. While this did raise my suspicions, I try not to be a judgmental person. There could have been a perfectly good explanation for all of this. He could have simply been stopping by to grab a few things before making his way home after a long day's work, so I profiled him as best as I could and kept on with my work. Things were fine for a while, until a couple of hours later, maybe around 8 o'clock, when I saw the same man in the same van, in the same spot, as though the mere thought of leaving hadn't even crossed his mind. Now again, I do realise that there could have been a perfectly reasonable explanation for this. He could have been out of gas and waiting for someone to bring him some. He could have been living in his car and had decided to park there for the night. He could have simply been napping peacefully in his car. But how would I know? He was still wearing the shades. I knew all of this, but the second I saw this, I may as well have sprinted to my manager. I was uneasy, but also trying to hide it, as to not alert anyone. I walked up to my manager, who luckily was not with any customers, and told him about this guy and the weird vibes I got from him. He said he'd have security on alert, but as of now there wasn't anything that they could do, as the guy hadn't done anything wrong. He then thanked me for bringing this to his attention, and I thanked him back and began to walk away. Unfortunately, up until this moment, I failed to realise that there was another associate standing kind of behind him, who then proceeded to come up to me and ask me more questions. I answered what I could, and thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. No panic was caused, but word did spread quickly amongst the front-end associates. I had made my way back outside, only to see that the van was gone. For a minute I figured the guy may have guessed that I was onto him and booked it before anything else could escalate. That is until I saw him again in a different spot of the parking lot, further back from the store. This set off a multitude of red flags, and my anxiety skyrocketed. At this point I decided to take a break. I figured I was just being paranoid and overly cautious, and decided I just needed to calm down. I went on lunch, grabbed a bite to eat, and came back 30 minutes later. You guessed it. Mr. Predator Guy was still sitting in the same spot as I'd last seen him. By this point I was still anxious, but I figured there was nothing I could do. So I went back to work and simultaneously cased the guy for another hour and a half, until he noticed me noticing him, and peeled out of there like the Fast and the Furious. He never showed up again after that, or at least I never saw him. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.